Welcome back to 1% Weekly. Never mind the Graham Rowan Show. This week it's more like the Graham Norton Show, as I have not one but two guests. First, we'll be talking to business turnaround expert Jonathan Jay about how to find the right kind of business to buy. Then we're going to hear from elite member Paul Cronin about his own journey to financial freedom. And finally, I want to share with you the tax revolution that seems to be passing Britain by. Today I want to introduce you to another of my secret weapons, one of the people I've worked closely with over the years who I want to bring into your living room today. Jonathan Jay is one of the country's leading experts on business turnarounds. He's bought and sold something like 25, 26 companies in the last 20 years, and he now helps other people to do the same through his deal-making academy. In this first interview, I asked him about how we can find the perfect business to buy, often for a lot less than you might expect to pay. Jonathan, I know how busy you are, so thanks very much for fitting us in.
Thank you for inviting me.
I know you've bought and sold something like 25, 26 companies in the last couple of decades, so you're kind of getting the hang of it now. What I want to try and cover over these next 4 sessions is the whole process, which I think you call finding it, funding it, fixing it, and flipping it. So if we start with how do you find a business for sale at a kind of a sensible price that you can add to your existing portfolio?
Well, that's a very good question to start with, because there are lots of businesses for sale. You have to just go to look at the brokers, and there are hundreds and hundreds of business brokers, and there's the corporate finance people who sort of deal with the bigger businesses. They do the same job as the business brokers. They just charge more money, and their offices are in Mayfair, but it's fundamentally the same process. But business brokers have there's a flaw, if you like, in the system, because to get the instruction, instruction from the client to say, we want exclusivity over the next 12, 24 months to sell your business, they sometimes inflate the value of the business, which is why it's not always sensible. And usually what happens is that the business owner, after 6 or 7 months, they realize that there's no interest in this company, or the people that expressed interest just vanish without a trace. So where do you find the businesses that haven't been influenced to believe they're sitting on a multi-million-pound asset when in actual fact it's lost money for the last 3 years? Well, the place to go is directly to the business owners. And that's what I do, and that's what I encourage other people to do. So I would be either actively marketing, which is doing all the things that people do to actively market, so online and offline. And I would also be talking to everyone I meet, always carry the business cards, and you never know who knows someone who's interested in selling their company.
So if I understand correctly, what you're saying is you might decide, let's say you're in the healthcare business in some way. You might look for another healthcare business that you could bolt onto that. But to find it, you might go and get a whole load of addresses of companies and send them letters. How would you actually make that approach?
Okay, so there's several things here. So the most sensible acquisition, if you own a business already, is another business that's very similar to yours. So when you buy the business that's similar to yours, you don't have 2 sets of infrastructure. You only have maybe one office, one location. So by combining the 2 businesses, so taking the contracts and the customers from this business and putting them into yours, you automatically get an improvement in your profits and obviously an increase in your revenue as well. So looking for businesses that are similar to yours, maybe part of your supply chain, maybe your clients, maybe businesses that are complementary, so they're not identical, but there is a fit with the customer base, so you can sell the products of one business to the customers of the other business. So that all makes sense as an acquisition strategy. And when you've got that acquisition strategy, you say, well, where are these businesses? And typically people are members of trade associations, so they're listed on websites. They can go to industry events. They can go to trade shows. There are direct mail lists, doing it the old-fashioned way, where you actually write a letter, put it in an envelope, put a stamp on it, and send it to someone. There are membership websites and places where you can post. So you can say, I'm interested in buying a business in this sector. Please PM me, private message me if you'd like to talk confidentially. So you can do all of these things. And I always suggest to people you do a little bit of everything all at the same time.
Okay. And I guess what people don't realise, if all you ever do is look at the adverts in the Sunday Times or whatever, is that businesses can be acquired for way less than the kind of advertised price, because it really perhaps depends on how motivated the owner is, but oftentimes what they actually just want is to escape from that business, and they're looking for somebody to take it off their hands.
So everyone thinks it's all about money because they've watched Dragon's Den and everyone's negotiating the value of 0.5% of their business, and you start to think that it is all about money. If someone's been in the business for 10, 15, 20, 25 years, they can get to the point where they've earned the money, they've done all right. In actual fact, the exit is no longer about the money because they've reached a point in life where they realise that having a little bit more money doesn't actually change their lifestyle that much. What would change their lifestyle is the freedom of not having to go to the office every day, the stress, the weight lifted from their shoulders. Some people describe their business as a millstone around their neck. So it's about getting out. So what becomes more important to those people is looking after the staff, looking after the clients, protecting the reputation, not changing the branding, looking after Sheila and accounts because she's been there for 20 years and she needs to be looked after. So all of these things which are emotional, non-monetary, more intangible items become far more important than the money. So actually, you can strike a deal, you can structure a deal that allows someone to feel as though they've been rewarded and they're being paid, but it's not all about writing a huge check on day one.
Okay, yeah, and obviously we do from time to time see these deals in the headlines. We had one recently with the sale of Homebase from the Australian company, where you can buy a seemingly huge business for £1. Now, I'm guessing there's a kind of a do not try this at home warning for this.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Now I've done this. I've bought businesses that are distressed, which is the correct phrase actually for a business that's in trouble, heading towards insolvency, or they are insolvent. And I've identified that there are inside that business some assets. Maybe it's a customer base. It could be the branding. It could be the relationship with the customers that has a value, but the value of the overall business is distorted by historic debt, which is usually HMRC, loans that have just been dragged along for years, and it hasn't been able to escape that. So when you buy the business for £1, you're typically buying all the bad stuff as well. And that's where knowledge and the right deal team around you are absolutely essential. So you do not try this at home, because otherwise you can fall flat on your face and those liabilities could pass to you personally. So it's very, very important to have the right expertise. And I've got an amazing team of people who really actually do the work for me. So when people say, well, Jonathan, how do you know how to do this and how to do that? Well, I don't need to, because I've got the people who've been doing it for years and they know exactly what to do and can guide the process.
Yeah, indeed. And I've met some of these people, and I certainly would vouch for that. If anyone's watching us who's kind of thinking of going into business, we've talked about add-ons to existing businesses. Mm-hmm. Would you recommend acquiring a business in this way as the starting point, or do you think somebody should have some prior business experience before trying to do this? Okay,
that's a really good question. So key point is that when you buy a business, you should not think of it as buying a job. So when you buy a business, you are buying a business as an investment. So let's say we go and buy shares in British Gas. We don't turn up at British Gas headquarters on Monday morning and say, where's my desk? Where do I start work? You're a shareholder. You're an investor in the business. And that's what the mindset that you need to have when you're doing a deal like this. So you can actually own a business that you really don't have any particular knowledge of running, because you're not going to run it. That's what the management team is there to do. And what I often do in a sector that I don't have any knowledge in, I hire expertise. So I hire someone who's going to consult with me, usually on like a half-day rate, because you can get a lot done in 3 hours, who can say, look, Jonathan, you need to do this, 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 and this is good, and this is bad, and this is what you need to do. Now, we know that 80% of businesses fail in the first 5 years. We also know that 70% of statistics are made up. So I'm not sure whether that's actually factually correct, but we know that most businesses just don't work. So the solution is, why don't you buy a business that's been running for at least 5 years, that's got past that hurdle of attracting customers, it's got its cash flow sorted to a certain degree, it's got systems in place, it's got an office, it's got staff, it's made all the mistakes. But maybe the owner wants to move on for some reason. Maybe they've got another business that's more exciting. Maybe they want to emigrate. Maybe it's their health. Maybe it's their partner's health, whatever it might be. So buy a business that's already up and running, and suddenly you go from an entrepreneur who could be tinkering around with an idea for years and never getting off the ground to someone who owns an established business. And let me tell you what you're really buying when you buy an established business. You're buying cash flow from day one. And most businesses wait years to get that positive cash flow.
Sounds exciting. For now, thank you very much, Jonathan.
Thanks, Graham.
So I hope that opened your eyes to the whole business of buying companies. You can do it for a lot less than you might have expected, and you can be very creative in terms of how you actually go about finding the right business for you. Now I want to move on to one of our own members, Paul Cronin, who's been on quite a journey himself over the last few years. And because of the book that's really changed his life more than any other, Rich Dad, Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki, we thought what we'd do is chart his life through the cash flow quadrant. If you're not familiar with it, he'll explain it in a moment, but this is a fascinating way of looking at where you are in your current journey and maybe what the next steps are that you need to take. So Paul, I think the starting point for our discussion has got to be this book that really changed your life, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Tell me how you came to read that book and why it changed your life so much.
Well, it was a bit of a false start actually, Graham, because I was working for a company based in Washington, DC, and I was traveling back from Dulles Airport. And what I usually used to do to while away the time on the plane was go to the business bookshop, buy a book. And this case, I bought Rich Dad, Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki. Got on the plane, started reading it. Air hostess says, do you want a drink? I had a couple of gin and tonics, closed the book, watched the film, fell asleep. And when I got home, guess what I did? I put the book on my bookcase, and it was there for 10 years gathering dust.
Wow.
And when I did read it, it was a complete eye-opener, and based on his principles, it's really changed my life. And I'll explain a bit more about that when I come on to talk about my property investments. Okay,
because I think it's amazing to me now. It's more than 20 years since that book got published, and still probably hardly 1 in 1,000 people understands the difference between an asset and a liability. So I think the core of the book is very much the cash flow quadrant, and what I'd like to do in these series of interviews that we're recording with you is to kind of tell your life story through that cash flow quadrant. So perhaps at first, if you want to just quickly run us through the 4 elements of the cash flow quadrant, and then we'll focus in on the first one.
Sure. Yeah, the cash flow quadrant's divided them into 4 sections, and top left-hand corner, it's the E quadrant where you're an employee, where you're working, you may be earning a good salary, but really you're working for the directors and the shareholders, and you're trading your time for money. And the majority of people are in that position, and there's nothing wrong with that, if you've got a good job and you're enjoying it, but a lot of people are in that quadrant not earning as much as they could do and also not enjoying it. And then the bottom left-hand corner is at the S quadrant, where you're self-employed, where you're still working for money, but you're working for yourself. And that can be a great thing if you can build a successful business. But often it's more challenging than being in the E quadrant, because you're often working harder without the benefits of working for a big company. But on the left-hand side of the quadrant, Robert Kiyosaki refers to that as the rat race, where you're working for money. Whereas on the other side of the quadrant, in the top right-hand corner, you're a business owner. That means you've got a business that runs without you. So if you're on holiday, the profits still flow into your bank account. And lastly, in the bottom right-hand corner, it's the I quadrant, the investor quadrant, where, again, you're building your assets and your investments, and you're investing smartly so that on that side of the quadrant, your money works for you. And when I looked at that, I thought, if I want to achieve what I really want to do, and that's be away from corporate life, not have to travel around the world selling things that don't actually exist or invisible things, and I wanted to spend my time traveling with my wife, I needed to get over to the right-hand side of the quadrant. And one thing I realized is that the vertical line that divides the left from the right is a barrier that stops people moving from the rat race into the fast track, as Robert Kiyosaki describes it. But that barrier is not lack of money, that barrier is fear of the unknown and adversity to risk. And it was, I wanted to find a business that would help me, and an investment model that would help me make that transition across to the other side.
That's fascinating because I think the power of Kiyosaki really was his ability to turn this into a story that becomes a page turner and a gripping story, but actually has this very powerful concept at its core. So let's start with that very first one, which, as you say, is where most people spend most of their lives. I know you spent a good chunk of your life, which is in the employee quadrant. So tell me about your life as an employee and how you progressed through that phase.
Sure. I went to school, got reasonable grades. I had a full start studying civil engineering, and I realized that wasn't for me. And then I saw an advert for a programmer, or software engineer as they're called nowadays. And I thought, yeah, computers are going to be big one day. And I think I've got more computers in my car than that we had at school. And so I became I got a job as a programmer. And I basically followed the money. I looked at who was making the money and who had the nice cars and the nice girlfriends. And I went from pre-sales to post-sales to pre-sales engineer into becoming a salesman. I was account manager for BT and won a really big telecommunication software project there. And then I was fortunate that a colleague that I met in my last corporate job started a company to build some software to help the likes of BT with some network problems based on the internet. And I joined that company as a European sales manager. I had stock options, and we did very well. And ultimately, we were bought by Cisco Systems, and I moved to Cisco, worked there for a while, which was a great experience, a great company.
Okay, so you're having a successful career, and I guess. You bought a main home. What did you do in terms of kind of investing at that stage when you're in the employee quadrant?
Yeah, I had some stocks and shares. I did all the IPOs. Got some advice from my father-in-law, who's an accountant, to do some VCTs and some things like that. But I didn't really understand how to make the benefit of the tax efficiency of those. We had a house that we paid off the mortgage because we thought that's the thing to do. We had a mortgage-free holiday home in Dorset, and I made the classic mistake that a lot of people that want to get on the property bandwagon did. We bought a ski apartment in Bansko, Bulgaria, off-plan for cash. And knowing what I know now, I'd never have done that. But because it's up and running, it actually exists, unlike a lot of people that have made investments in Bulgaria. But it's costing us about £150 a month to keep our head above water with that one. Whereas if that money was in my portfolio that I have now, it would be making me probably £3,000 a month.
But I guess part of it is when you're in the employee quadrant, you're kind of focused on your career progression and so on. Did you find it challenging to put much time into any idea of building and creating wealth outside of your job at that point?
I was always aware of the need for it, but quite honestly, I was traveling a lot, and when I came home at the weekends, it was time with the kids. We had twin girls and then a son. So I didn't, I always, during my property investments, which I'm doing now, I've pretty much buried my head in the sand as far as that's concerned. I know that there's a need to be efficient in tax. I know there's a need to plan for succession. But really, I thought that's something I could do later.
Okay, so for those that are watching us who are in that employee quadrant, what would you say are the kind of signs they should look for that they are not necessarily doing things in as smart a way as Robert Kiyosaki would suggest?
Well, it's funny you say that, because I've got friends that the clock is just ticking until retirement and they're really not enjoying themselves. And I'm thinking, we're only on this, on this planet for, was it 3 school years and 10, if, hopefully more. But my advice is that there is more to life than corporate life. And I realized that for the first time in my life, I was doing a sales job where I wasn't enjoying myself. because most of the time I've been selling invisible things. That's what you do when you're in a startup. But for the first time, I wasn't enjoying working with my boss. And I was sitting in Brussels airport. We were traveling with budget airlines because we were a startup company. And then the plane was cancelled, and I thought, there's more to life than this. And I wanted to do something different. So I basically, much to my friends' dismay, I jacked in my job, and I went to do something rather different.
Well, next time we'll find out all about that. For now, Paul Cronin, thank you very much. So that was kind of Paul's journey as an employee through the corporate world. Next week, we'll find out what happened when he stepped away from that to become self-employed. I'm grateful to Elite member Nick Rathall for sending me this article by Alistair Heath on our tax system, or more precisely on how it compares with some other countries and what they're doing at the moment, because our politicians are locked into their usual kind of behavior of we need to raise more taxes, we need to go after the rich, we need to squeeze them until the pips squeak, all that kind of stuff. And it really is starting to be very much counter-trend, because it's not just Donald Trump that's been introducing some tax reductions lately. What we have here is a situation where, if you listen to the Tax Titans interview I did with Dominic Frisby and Gintas Vilkelis, we have this idea that, not only do we have the most complex and biggest tax code in the world, but there seems to be this idea that it'll just go on and on and on, raising more taxes and spending more without ever recognizing the destructive impact that has on the real wealth creators, the business owners, the entrepreneurs, the savers, the investors, and so on. And there's a strong argument put forward there that you should tax income less and maybe tax wealth like land or assets in that way. But it's interesting to look at what else is going on around Europe, because I don't know how close you've been to what's going on in Italy at the moment, but they are suggesting something which will be the most radical tax reform in Europe for about 50 years. At the moment in Italy, you pay tax somewhere between 23 and 43%. But the proposals are to substantially increase personal allowances and to bring the tax rates down to 15 and 20% respectively. Now that would have a massive impact on the Italian economy, which has frankly been on life support for about 20 years. They're also talking about having a parallel currency to run alongside the euro, which is a nice way of kind of not leaving the euro, but kind of putting Brussels and co. on warning that we're just looking at something else here. Maybe we've got a plan B. A very nice thing to have up your sleeve if there are any kind of tricky negotiations to go through. They haven't actually said it would be a cryptocurrency yet, but that's the next thing I'm waiting for. That's kind of the Venezuelan model for how to cure all the ills of society. Have the government do an initial coin offering. Oh, really? Can't wait to get in the queue for that one. It's not even just Italy that's doing this. Would you believe France has got in on the act as well? Emmanuel Macron has taken investments and savings out of the calculations for wealth tax in France. And again, that's one of the most progressive things that's happened there, probably since about the 1980s. And why has he done it? Not just because he feels, well disposed towards savers and investors. It's because money has been hemorrhaging out of France for years. Why do you think there are 1/3 or more French people living in London, many of them entrepreneurs? Because they go to where they're well looked after. And for a French person, setting up a business in Britain has been a good thing to do from a tax perspective for some years now. And it's not just happening in Europe. Donald Trump obviously has made major tax cuts recently, but they're going to do the same thing in Australia. At the moment in Australia, the tax bands are around 37%. That's going to be replaced with a 32.5% tax band, and they're going to reduce corporation tax because they want to flatten and simplify the tax code. Why are all these other countries, all these other governments thinking that this is a good thing when our own just buries its head in the sand and keeps on coming up with more of the same? You may have seen recently that the budget deficit was actually at the lowest level since the financial crisis. Now that doesn't mean it's gone down or that our national debt has gone away, but the actual rate of increase in the debt had subsided slightly, and this was seen as good news. Well, rather than using any good news to get rid of some of these taxes, what they're saying is, oh, well, we'll just spend that money on the NHS. And the NHS, frankly, is just a black hole for government spending. Remember how much Gordon Brown and New Labour piled into it with very little productivity gains? Yes, we all want the NHS to be effective, but boy, do they have to restructure it and get a bit more efficient at how they use their resources. So here's the message to Philip Hammond and Theresa May. Look at what's happening in the rest of the world. Why do you think they're doing it? They've got a bigger picture in their sights than you have at the moment. You're so obsessed with Brexit that you're not putting enough time into some of the other ways in which we could really change the nature of British society, really encourage energy, effort, business, enterprise, and have a much more thriving economy post-Brexit. Please, let's have some simplification of taxes. Let's get rid of some of the irrelevant and stupid taxes like inheritance tax, maybe even corporation tax itself. Let's have some radical thinking, because we should not be behind the likes of France, Italy, Australia. This is embarrassing, Theresa. Get your act together. Thanks for watching 1% Weekly. I hope you got some great ideas about buying a business from Jonathan J, and some inspiration from the first part of Paul Cronin's story. Now, I don't know how much of this kind of technology you have in your home, but I've always been a little bit wary of these things that you talk to, not just because they might talk back, but because it could get a lot worse than that in a very connected world. And if you saw that recent tale of somebody's Amazon Echo, it recorded a private conversation and then sent it to one of the contacts in their list. Can you imagine what could have been the outcome of all that? It turns out that one of the words the lady said sounded a bit like Alexa, so it switched itself on. And then another of the words that she said sounded a bit like one of her contacts, so it thought, oh, you must want me to send this to that contact. I mean, what could she have been talking about? I shudder to think. But the woman, called Danielle, has apparently said, I felt invaded. I'm never going to plug that device in again. I can't trust it. I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching 1% Weekly. If you've enjoyed what you've seen, you might want to click here to subscribe for future episodes, or you might want to click here to watch this other video. What are you waiting for? My arms are getting tired.